Assalamu alaikum. May peace be with you all. A warm welcome to the fourth plenary session of two-day international conference on translating cultures, exploring the intersections of language and literature. We express our gratitude to all esteemed guests and distinguished participants for their presence and valuable contribution. I'm Rumana Nisar, research scholar in the Department of English, Maulana Azad National Urdu University. Yesterday, we embarked on a remarkable journey of exploring the intricate relationship between language, culture, and translation. Today, we continue our quest to unravel the complexities of translating cultures. With renewed eagerness and the shared commitment to the advancing of our understanding of the themes of conference, let's embark upon this plenary session. It's now my distinct honor and privilege to invite the esteemed chair of the plenary session, Professor Haribandi Lakshmi, to join us on the stage. Ma'am, please. Professor Lakshmi is the head of Department of Translation Studies, English and Foreign Language University, Hyderabad. Professor Lakshmi has made significant contribution to the academic community through her extensive publication. She has authored several books, including Problems of Translation, a study of literary and technical text, and Translation Studies, Theory and Practice, among others. These publications highlight her deep understanding of translation theory and practices. Moreover, Professor Lakshmi has published numerous research papers in professional journals and contributed to chapters to various books. Her research interests cover a wide range of topics, such as problems in cross-cultural communication, post-colonial translation, norms in translation, and the representation of other cultures through translation. As an accomplished translator herself, Professor Lakshmi has also published translations of literary works from languages like Bengali, Marathi, Punjabi, Hindi, Russian, and Canadian English into Telugu. Professor Haribandi's contribution to the field of translation studies, her dedication to academic excellence, and her commitment to promoting cultural exchange through translation makes her highly regarded and influential figure in the academic community. We welcome you, ma'am, here. It's my great pleasure to invite our first distinguished speaker for this plenary session to join us on the stage, Professor Panchanan Mohante, Head Department of English, GLA University. Sir, please. With a career spanning decades in the field of linguistics, Professor Mohante's expertise and contribution are truly remarkable. Having served as Professor of Applied Linguistics at University of Hyderabad, Professor Mohante had participated in over 350 national and international seminars, conferences, and workshops. He has published over 165 papers in esteemed journals covering various aspects of linguistics and language-related studies. Beyond his academic pursuits, Professor Mohante has actively worked towards preserving and protecting endangered languages. He has conducted fieldwork on small and tribal languages in Odisha and Maharashtra, leading to the discovery of previously undocumented languages. Professor Mohante's dedication to linguistic diversity is further evident through his involvement in committees and advisory bodies focused on language preservation and cultural studies. Today, we have the privilege of benefiting from Professor Panchanan Mohante's wealth of knowledge and experience. We welcome you, sir, here. I'm now honored to invite our second distinguished speaker of this plenary session, Professor Ellen Desolier. Sir, please join us on the stage. Professor Ellen is an eminent scholar and translator in the field of Urdu literature and history of India. Professor Ellen has been associated with INALCO, Sorbonne, where he has dedicated his expertise to the study of Urdu language and literature for foreign students. His translation include works by renowned Urdu authors such as Saadat Hasan Manto, capturing the essence and beauty of Urdu literature for a wider audience. His research interest encompasses a wide range of topics, from circulation and adaptation of Arabian Nights tales in Urdu to the history of Gujarati navigation towards Southeast Asia. He has been a visiting fellow at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, where he has engaged with fellow scholars and contributed to conferences and seminars. His involvement with National Translation Mission Mysore further exemplifies his commitment to fostering cross-cultural understanding through translation mission. Notably, Professor Allen has also explored the intersection of Urdu literature with Indian cinema, examining the representation of historical figures and cultural themes in films. However, before I conclude, please allow me to apologize if my pronunciation of Professor Allen's name falls short of its accurate representation. Thank you, and may we find inspiration and enlightenment in today's proceedings. I would like the worthy chair to take the proceedings from here. Ma'am.
Namaskar and good morning. We are already starting the session. I reserve some time at the end of the presentations for my comments. So without wasting any time, I would like to invite the first speaker, Professor Manjunath Mahanti. Sir, you can take up to 20 minutes, sir.
Good morning, namaskar, assalamu alaikum. Somebody else commits this sin and I am punished for that. It's okay, that's the way life is. So I will go by whatever the chairperson says. So thank you. I'll be talking about something which may sound like very basic, but I think such things need to be discussed. The topic, see, the chairperson has already given me a task to complete it in 20 minutes. The topic was suggested to me by a very close friend. He's sitting in front of us. And the topic is translating across cultures, problems and issues. The problem is, what is translation? I'm sure those of you who have, who have been listening to the presenters, if somebody asks me to say what translation means, I'll say, I don't know. The reason is all sorts of things have been discussed in the name of translation. All sorts of things. Yesterday, that's what, I started discussing. Is translation a word or a term? That has to be decided. If translation is a word, do whatever you like. That's not an issue. Because you can, a word, the meaning of a word gets extended, that's not an issue at all. Take, for example, let's say this is my head. When I say that Professor Shugupta Shahin is the head of the department, she is not this of the department. It's head of the department. Okay. Suppose we say that Professor Hassan is the head of this university. He's not the head of this university. So words can have extended meanings, not terms. My question here is very specific. Should we say that translation is a word or a term? If you are talking about translation as a part of scientific discourse, it has to be a term. Then if it is a term, you cannot meddle with it. It is monosemantic in nature. It must have only one meaning, not many meanings. And I want to discuss this. Translation, as you know, it's commonplace. It's derived from the Latin word translatus. The Frenchman is sitting here. I hope, I know about Latin, not Latin. The past participle, this is the past participle of transfere, which is related to transfer, or which literally means to carry over from one language to another language. Okay. Now, but what people have done is that people have, without, I don't know whether I say that, well, without reading the details of all these things, whatever has been discussed, people have started, it is in a hunting ground for, it is an interdiscipline, I told you yesterday. It's an interdiscipline, but I find indiscipline in whatever is being done. Let me be very clear, loud about that. Because anybody can say, I have worked in a center, department which is called Center for Applied Linguistics and Translation Studies. People do culture studies, adaptation studies, film studies, everything in the name of translation studies. Everything in the name of translation studies. It's just here at University of Hyderabad. I'm saying that loudly. Whenever I said this shouldn't be done, they said no, the majority. Immediately they said, no, please don't say that. Nothing to do with translation. They talk about that. They have done it. PhD, MPhil dissertations have been written and okayed. Okay. Now, what I will do is that I'll quote some people who are very, very, I should say, great names in the field of literature, in the field of translation studies, etc. So let's start with Umberto Eco. I'm sure he's probably one of the greatest writers of our times, passed away, only a few years ago. It is from his experiences in translation, 2008. It seems to me that I'm reading whatever he has written in this book. It seems to me that studying translation is like studying bilingualism. Any study on bilingualism is primarily performed by observing the behavior of a child exposed to two languages, and only continuous daily observation yields sufficient data on the development of a double linguistic competence. Now, some linguists have said that such observation is possible only if one is a linguist, two, working with bilingual children, and three, prepared to follow their linguistic behavior on a day-to-day basis from the earliest stages. This means that a reliable study of bilingualism could be made only by a parent who is a linguist, married to a foreigner, preferably one interested in linguistic matters. I think that a theory of translation should meet similar requirements. This is quite important. If translation studies are concerned with the process of translation from a source text A in a language alpha to a target text B in a language beta, then translation scholars should have had, I repeat, translation scholars should have had at least once in their life both the experience of translating and that of being translated, obviously into a language they know, so that they can work in close cooperation with their translator. This is what Umberto Eco says. Sometimes people blame me, oh, you are a linguist, you quote only linguist. Eco was never a linguist, and you know who Eco was. Okay. Now, this is what Eco says. All right, let's talk about some others. Then Eugene Nida, probably one of the greatest names in translation studies. This is, when he wrote a book with his Chinese counterpart, Jin D. It is 2006. Some persons, I quote them, some persons object to a theory of translation. First of all, because it seems unnecessary or even misleading. This is seriously true of some wrong theories of translation. But everyone has a theory of translation as to what one should do, how it should be done, and why. A theory, however, is more than simply a list of rules, for no list could ever cover everything which a translator must or can do. The theory is an organized set of principles pointing the way to find proper solutions, unquote. This is what Naida says. I hear a lot of discussion, people use time and again cultural translation. I don't know what they have read. I have no idea. I'm quoting Anthony Pym, who is one of the greatest scholars who has worked on these areas. Anthony Pym, 2010, Exploring Translation Theories. He says, I'm quoting him, cultural translation can be understood as a process in which there is no start text and usually no fixed target text. This is what is meant by cultural translation. No start text, no fixed target text. The focus is on cultural processes rather than products. And when you talk about cultural translation, do you understand all these things? Just use terms because you are given an opportunity to do that. That's what we have been doing. Okay. He also says, the paradigm thus helps us think about a globalizing world in which start and target sides are neither stable nor entirely separate. Now, if you have this kind of framework, can you talk about translation studies or translation to be specific? With these things, I think I will have, to say whatever I want to say. Then I will quote another person, André Lefebvre, who holds a very similar kind of view. He says, translation is not just a window open to another world or some such pious platitude. Rather, translation is a channel opened, often not without certain reluctance, through which foreign influences penetrate the native culture, challenge it, and even contribute to subverting it. Now, if this is the case, when we are talking about domestication and foreignization, I mean, if you domesticate, there is no kind of foreign influence because you have already domesticated that. And for your information, this is not Venuti's ideas. Venuti has coined these two terms. There is somebody called Schleiermacher, who I have his quotation somewhere. He says that there are two ways to translate. Either you take the readers to the original author or bring the original author to the readers. So that's what, Venuti took his ideas and talked about foreignization and domestication. Okay. Now, I want to point out here that Lefebvre has preferred to use translation again in the second sentence instead of using the pronoun it. He doesn't like translation to be a pious platitude. Suzanne Besneth has been more vocal about it when she states, translation is therefore particularly special activity since it enables a text to continue live in another context, and the translated text becomes an original by virtue of its continued existence in the new context. Okay. Now, yesterday also I was talking about, the translation is not only literary translation. Translation is very, very wide. Even if you use Amritanjan, that pain balm, open it and see how many languages are there and see how the things have been translated. Use whatever you say, translation is there. Yesterday, I was talking about that word, for which I was saying 70 million. I'm sorry, it is $71 million word. It was back in 1980, the 18-year-old whose name was Willie Ramirez was admitted into a Florida hospital. The hospital staff had plenty of people around who spoke Spanish. This was Florida after all, so finding someone to communicate wasn't a problem. Willie's family members said that they thought he was intoxicado in Spanish. That's the word, intoxicado. The first impression of the word intoxicado is misleading. It doesn't mean intoxicated, but unfortunately for Willie, that's how it was interpreted into English by the bilingual staff person who had been roped into interpreting. Due in great part to this misinterpreted word, Willie was diagnosed incorrectly, leading to the wrong course of treatment and eventually to quadriplegia. What does intoxicado really mean and how do you say it in English? Unfortunately, there really isn't a perfect linguistic equivalent. Intoxicado refers to a state of poisoning, usually from ingesting something that is toxic to the system. And for this, there is a court case, and because of the mistake, Ramirez was diagnosed with an intentional drug overdose. He received a malpractice settlement of $71 million. I wish I was there. It was later discovered that his symptoms were the result of not of food poisoning after all, but of an intercerebral hemorrhage. Because of the amount of the settlement, the word intoxicado is sometimes referred to in translation circles as the $71 million word. This is what translation means. And as all of you know, people have been executed for translation. Professor Resiliers is sitting here. There's a person called Etienne Dolet, executed 500 years ago, 400 years ago, because of, wrongly translating within quotes Aristotle. And there are other issues also. Yesterday we were talking about Sulman Rushdie, and I could probably, I don't know, a Japanese translator was stabbed to death in 1991. And another 2 persons were attacked, but luckily they didn't die. So this is what translation can do. So when we are talking about translation, it's time we started or we became extremely careful. Okay. All right. Then how many minutes, Lakshmi Garu? Okay. Okay. Now, here, of course, people always translation, I very strongly believe, and there's nothing to believe, between the deductive and the inductive approaches. In social sciences, it should always be inductive. Even these sciences, the so-called hard sciences, are mostly inductive in nature. When you cannot follow an inductive approach, you follow a deductive approach. Otherwise, it's always inductive. Approaches are always much better. And being in humanities, our approaches should have been inductive. Now, in this context, I would like to quote Gideon Torrey, descriptive translation studies. It's not prescriptive translation studies. I am nobody to say this is the way to translate. No. When you are discussing translation studies or something talking about hypothesis theories, why don't you see what actually translators have been doing? Look at the data, from data to theory, a bottom-up approach kind of thing. That's quite important. That's which we most of us don't do in this country, in many parts of the world. Okay. Now I'll be talking about some people. Sometimes people say that, oh, poetry is lost in translation. I don't think it's a good approach. It's a correct approach. Let me be very bold enough to say it's not a correct approach. I'll give you examples. Yesterday, somebody quoted Newmark, Peter Newmark. While comparing the 2 German translations of Baudelaire's Requiem, please forgive me for my mispronunciation of the French one, by Walter Benjamin and Stefan George, Newmark, 1988, convincingly demonstrates that the latter, that is Stefan George, has rightly been considered a better translator because he is closer to the original, not because he is free. He again states, both lexically and grammatically, George's openings are nearer to Baudelaire than Benjamin's. The word and clause order correspondence in George and Baudelaire is striking. He recommends that serious imaginative literature should be translated literally. I repeat, he recommends that serious imaginative literature should be translated literally. And now I quote him: literal translation is the first step in translation, and a good translator abandons a literal translation only when it is plainly inexact or badly written. A bad translator will always do his best to avoid translating word for word. This is something which comes from Peter Newmark, one of the most celebrated names in the field of translation. A bad translator will always do his best to avoid translating word for word. I mean, these are the people who have spent their life. And you know that when I read Eco, who should be a translator? A person who has translated and who has been translated also. That's important. Then you know where the shoe pinches. That's quite important. Okay. I'll quote another person. This is Alan Duff. We always give a lot of credit to Homi Bhabha for his third space. It's not his idea, original. It's not his idea. It is Alan Duff who talked about, the title of his book is The Third Language. It was published in 1984. 84. It should be there, somewhere there. Anyway, it will be there. Oh, 88. I think now Homi Bhabha's book was published in 1998. 10 years gap was there, something like that. Okay. Now, having analyzed a number of translations from other languages into English, it is inductive. See, he's now taking the data first, then he comes to a kind of hypothesis. Alan Duff, 1908 states, I'm quoting him, the thought and care invested by the translator should be directly proportional to the thought and care invested by the writer. The translator must think with the writer. The translator must think with the writer, but he cannot do this thinking for him. The translator cannot think for the writer. That's very important. Those people who think that you can take, liberty, why don't you write something original? Why do you want to, meddle with somebody else's text and do it? If you have the guts, if you have the talent, write something original. When you are translating my text, why are you doing that? Okay. Then another person, another two writers, I'm sure those who do translations know them, Vinay and Darbalnath, they emphasize, I quote them, literalness should only be sacrificed because of structural and metalinguistic requirements. And only after checking that, the meaning is fully preserved. This is something which is very important. And there are, this is what Nabokov, Steiner, a lot of people have held this kind of view. I mean, when we're talking about translation study, something on translation in translation studies, should we not take into account all this, whatever these people have said? We all in a sudden come as if you are theoreticians, we say whatever we have been trying to say. Anyway, okay. Look, this is what we have discussed. And now I will say what yes. How many minutes? 4 minutes are there. So you are not cheering. Anyway, okay. Now I'll quote a couple of people. One of them is Sitakant Mahapatra. Not he is because of an Odia, but I like whatever he has said. Now he is a Gyanpith Awardee some time ago. One of the most widely translated contemporary Indian writers, a Gyanpith Awardee Odia poet, states, I'm quoting him, some of my work was translated directly from Odia to foreign languages. Others were translated via English. I have my reservations about such retranslations. But my consolation is that the translators are major poets themselves. I got the feeling from some reviews that these translations were done with sensitivity and love for the original. I'll quote another person, a Latin American, not an Indian, Giovanni Pontiero. I hope the pronunciation is correct. It's Gio, G-I-O. one of the most celebrated Latin American translators, he expresses, I quote, "I never take liberties with a text at the outset, because a translator's main concern is, like the author himself, with words. In one sense, a translator task is even more difficult than that of the writer, for he must subordinate himself to two languages, not one. But how can I then move from faithful rendering to a creative interpretation of the source text? Here, my approach is to be as literal as possible in the first instance, to capture as much of the author's idiosyncrasies as are transferable into the target language, and only at the first revision to make the adjustments required by the demands of the target language. So this is what people say when you talk about translation is this, that, one must be a little more careful. And I hope, these remarks are quite important, at least to me when I translate, and it's quite important. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you.
We'll come back to your paper at the end. I'm sure there will be many questions. So translation is such a general topic, such a wide area. All of us can have our own perspectives, linguistic perspective or cultural perspective. So there's nothing like right or wrong. All are correct. Okay, you can have several perspectives. All are equally right. So I invite the second speaker, Ellen Desiliers. He will be speaking on translating and comparing mystical love concepts and metaphors in Urdu and Spanish poetry. Please, sir.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank this university for and the authorities for their genuine hospitality and friendship. Now, I'm talking about San Juan de la Cruz, Spanish mystical poetry, and Urdu mystical poetry. Of course, most of you...
If you want, you can sit, sir. Make yourself comfortable, no problem.
Yes, but will I'm comfortable here. Yeah, because I can have a look. So, most of you are, I believe, much more aware than myself about tasawwuf in Urdu poetry. So I'm not going to give a lecture about that, rather use my translations as a tool to make a comparative study about San Juan de la Cruz, rather Juan de la Cruz, John of the Cross, and whatever simple, I would say, metaphors we have in common. So it's a well-established fact that Urdu poetry, from its inception in 16th and 17th century, आगे जाइएगा, please. Yeah. Precisely in Golconda and Hyderabad, while evoking Ishq Majazi, earthly love, was also invoking Ishq-e-Hakiki, real love, that is divine love. Poets, while writing for their often royal patrons, were keen to show that they were sharing some common concepts in mysticism and tasawwuf, in mysticism, that is tasawwuf. In addition to immediate lyrical sensual songs echoing the Persian rubai, quatrains, and ghazal tradition, Persian Sufi conventions and symbols were also blended with Indian mystic and lyric traditions. In Urdu poetry, though it did not happen in Urdu only, royal or saintly patronage and sometimes both contributed to its fame. And that lasted at least for 2 centuries in imperial or royal courts. Next, please. Yes. We shall quote here for 4 well-known conventions and symbols used as literary metaphors in classical and 19th century poetry in short quotation. by Walid Akhni, Mir Taqi Mir, Ghalib, or Qatil Shifai, in order to make a very limited, but I hope significant enough comparative study with two 16th century Spanish predicators and writers. In short, those metaphors are the rose garden, Gulshan, the tavern and wine, Mekada, the lock of hair, Zulf, the union with the beloved, Visal. So now, what about these two poets and preachers I'm referring to from Spanish 16th century? During the so-called, next please. Yes, thank you. During the so-called Siglo de Oro, then in the Golden Age, beginning 16th to mid 17th century, Spanish language, in those days very close to Portuguese when it came here, by the way, knew an exceptional growth in literary achievements, particularly in lyrical poetry, but also of a deeply religious, also deemed to be Roman Catholic character. In fact, in the Iberian Peninsula, there was a non-acknowledged Hebrew and Arabic heritage among the so-called converts, former, not so former, Jews or Muslims, many of them being a highly cultivated elite, sometimes within the Catholic hierarchy or the royal court, even within the Inquisition, by the way. Though often prosecuted and persecuted, they would use their rich cultural heritage, Hebrew, Arabic, and Latin, and talent to work as intermediaries, sometimes translators, Christian prose and poetry, and produce Christian prose and poetry that the king and the church were needing. Among Urdu poets, not necessarily Muslims, themes and images of Sufi mysticism, tasawwuf, are very often present under a lyrical and amorous guise. But the reverse is also true. Lyrical and sensual poetry is very often the first step for a spiritual walk, and that goes also for the verses of Juan de la Cruz, whom we are going to talk about in his Camino Espiritual. That is, Camino is like Arabic tahriq, spiritual walking, tariqa. And for the preaching of Santa Teresa de Avila and her 7 castles, Siete Castillos, or Maqamat. She doesn't say Maqamat, but in those days, everybody understood. To go from imperfect love to perfect love. So Juan de la Cruz, convert, preacher, jailed poet, and finally saint. We select only one Spanish famous mystic poet, Juan de la Cruz, 1568 and 1591, also known as San Juan de la Cruz, as he was later officially canonized and recognized as a saint. It is important to note his family background. He was from a Jewish family, quite recently and forcibly converted to Catholicism. His parents and grandparents were originally from Toledo, a city I know very well, the city of the 3 languages and cultures up to the end of 14th century. Hebrew, Latin, and Arabic, with a renowned school of translators. Spanish Jews had long adopted Arabic as their cultural language and heritage, but would also preserve their biblical Hebrew, while Latin was there for official translation. Well, classical Hebrew and classical Arabic are not very far away languages, by the way. From the very beginning, Juan de la Cruz had a trilingual heritage, though that was no more officially acknowledged. The newly created Jesuit order was quick to recognize his skills, educate him, and employ him as a preacher. They wouldn't say translator. We would like to say that, like his predecessors, he was also a skilled translator. It took no less than 400 years to acknowledge those facts, veiled by a very late declaration of sanctity. It was easier to declare him a saint with divine inspiration than to say, that he was a former Jew. That said, the high quality of his religious poetry is in no way put into question. His cantico spiritual, mystical song was salvaged from the Inquisition by other conversos and converts, mostly nuns in Catholic convents. He was a preacher and a confessor for the nuns. Many of them were converts, and one of them, Teresa de Avila, 1515 and 1582, was particularly active in her mystic writings, echoing Juan de la Cruz and preserving much of his original preaching, that is, using the same metaphors. Teresa de Avila herself was also from a converted family. Indeed, Juan de la Cruz, when arrested and jailed in Toledo for half a year by the Spanish Church and Inquisition, as suspected of non-Catholic practice, he is said to have swallowed most of his compromising writings. He escaped from the jail, probably helped by his former Jewish masters, Jesuit masters, and went on preaching in France before coming back with an aura of sanctity. Later on, Teresa de Avila was also recognized as a saint, as she has written very convincing preaches and was the founder of a new religious order. Here I'm indebted to Luce Lopez Baralt and her San Juan de la Cruz y el Islam, 1990, whose work I discovered too late in my career. And her work has been really thought-provocative in Spain. But even today, some people try to deny this reality. Some people try to ignore the fact that good translation and adaptation can make wonderful poetry and powerful thinking. A first point would have been a thorough reading of Juan de la Cruz poetry in mysticism in order to make a complete parallel with one Urdu poet, more or less of his times, like Wali Muhammad Wali, by translating into English the most significant passages. I am presently doing that in French for the philosophy department of Clermont-Ferrand University. Indeed, the English translation as a tool in comparative literature should be first a literal one, focusing on the terminal terms here of mysticism. So, of course, some metaphors are universals, but others are very peculiar to some important writers. And it does not deprive them of originality. When Juan de la Cruz adapts from oral and Hebrew, oral Arabic language and Hebrew on one hand, and when Urdu poets adapt Persian and concept to Indian, Persian poetry and concept to Indian culture, it does not mean they are not original. Now, the concept we are going to see, the mystical garden of amenity, I translate literally from Spanish, huerto ameno, lecho florido, that is the flower bed, but the nuptial flower bed. El alma como jardín místico, the soul like a mystic garden, referring to Chaman and Gulshan. Gulshan being literally rose garden also. The tavern and wine, tavern sorry for the E, that is French, and wine. El vino, la interior bodega. Now, Juan de la Cruz could not mention Mecada. I am quite sure that in 16th century, people, even in Spain, was aware of Persian tradition. That through Sicily, actually. But he calls it La Interior Bodega. That is the tavern I have into my soul. The intimate tavern or intimate Mecada. La Embriaguez Mística. That is the drunkenness as ecstasy. Mecada, Mejana, Bejabri. The lock of hair, el cabello como gancho espiritual. Now, gancho in Spanish is a hook. You see, you hook the beloved with, sorry, I don't have them anymore, with a spiritual hook. The union with the beloved, la unión con el amado. Now, you see, Juan de la Cruz had a problem with the gender of amado. It had to be masculine. While in the Arabic, mashuk is not masculine nor feminine. The union with the beloved, the matrimonio espiritual, the spiritual marriage, visale yar. Now this is just a chart. I would just comment one, that is el vino adobado. You know, those who, among you who may know Arabic much better than me must know the radical zub, azub, decorated. From that, in Spanish, we had adobe. And then even in information technology, we have Adobe also. That is Spanish. Spanish from Arabic. So Juan de la Cruz, when he wants to mention wine as a way to ecstasy, he calls it vino adobado. That is arca al-azub. You see, decorated wine. He doesn't know how to translate it, but he has a beautiful sentence. Vino adobado. En tan solo es cabello, in one hair, with only one hair, you hook me, you know. So let us just have a few quotations. Canción 22. Entrado sea la esposa en el ameno huerto deseado, y a su sabor reposa el cuello reclinado sobre los dulces brazos del amado. Sorry for my reading in Spanish, but you have to hear the music, because the music is part of it. So I risk an English sort of translation. The garden of amenity the bride has entered. In its perfume, she is resting, her neck reclining on the sweet arms of the beloved. So we go from Ishke Majazi to Ishke Hakiki. Now another song. Detente cierzo muerto, ven, austro, que recuerdas los amores, aspira por mi huerto y corran sus olores y pacera el amado entre las flores. Hold your cold breath, wind of death. Do come, Mistral, that is the wind from the south. Do come, Mistral, of love's remembrance. Blow over my garden, let loose your fragrance. Among flowers, let the beloved feast. If I was an Urdu poet, I would say that Urdu translation would be much easier. El vino adobado, the elaborated wine. Now, it's not here, quoted directly here, but it was in his mind, and he talks very often about it. Now, this is another stanza. En la interior bodega de mi amado bebí, y cuando salía por toda aquesta vega, ya cosa no sabía, y el ganado perdí que antes seguía. I drank in the interior tavern of my beloved, but when I went out into this moor, I knew nothing anymore, and I lost the herd that I had followed. So he comes into Bekhabri. I knew nothing anymore. Ya cosa no sabía. I knew nothing at all. I was, Bekhabri. So I sort of found a quotation in Urdu to illustrate this, more or less. निकल कर देर व काबा से अगर मिलता ना मैं खाना तो टकराए हुए इंसान खुदा जाने कहाँ जाते. Coming out of the temple and the Kaaba is the tavern. It is not on the way. If the tavern is not on the way, then God knows where this shaken up human would go astray. And then I compare with the Spanish words. Now they are in English. You see, the what Juan de la Cruz says. And you can say that it is not very far. I drank in the interior tavern of my beloved, but when I went out into this moor, I knew nothing anymore, and I lost the herd that I had followed. Now, San Juan de la Cruz, Spanish mystical poetry and Urdu mystical poetry, El Cabello, the hair lock. En solo aquel cabello que en mi cuello volar consideraste, mirástele en mi cuello y en él preso quedaste, y en uno de mis ojos te llagaste. In that lock of hair you fancied to take, and that you spotted in my neck, in that a prisoner you remained, and in one of my eyes you were wounded. Now, I tried to take another term that is el huerto, gulshan. अफसोस अहल दीद को गुलशन में जा नहीं, नरगिस के गू के आंखें हैं पर सोचता नहीं. Las, spectators have no place in the rose garden. Narcissus seems to have eyes, but he doesn't see. Now, sorry, I misplaced this quotation. I'm coming back to the tavern, La Interior Bodega, the tavern of the soul, which is a more important, I think, figure. En la interior bodega de mi amado bebí, y cuando salía por toda aquesta vega, ya cosa no sabía, y el ganado perdí que antes seguía. I drank in the interior tavern of my beloved, but when I went out into this moor, I knew nothing anymore, and I lost the herd that I had followed. Now, you see, drunkenness is in Spanish poetry here, very much linked with fana, actually. निकल कर देरो काबा से अगर मिलता ना मैं खाना तो टकराए हुए इंसान खुदा जाने कहाँ जाते. Coming out of the temple of the Kaaba, if the cavern is not on the way, then God knows where this shaken up human would go astray. Now, this is the Spanish one into English. I drank in the interior tavern of my beloved, but when I went out into this moor, I knew nothing anymore, and I lost the herd that I had followed. That I translated from Spanish. Now the hair lock, el cabello. Es la canción 31, the song number 31 of Juan de la Cruz. En solo aquel cabello que en mi cuello volar consideraste, mirástele en mi cuello y en él preso quedaste, en uno de mis ojos te liagaste. In that lock of hair you fancied to take, and that you spotted in my neck, in that a prisoner you remained, and in one of my eyes you were wounded. So we come to the rose garden now, el huerto in Spanish. अफसोस अहल दीद को गुलशन में जा नहीं, नरगिस के गू के आंखें हैं पर सोचता नहीं. So, last spectators have no place in the rose garden. Narcissus seems to have eyes, but he doesn't see. Now in Spanish, we have not direct scene, but something that relates to that idea also. Nuestro lecho florido de cuevas de leones enlazado, en púrpura tendido, de paz edificado, de mil escudos de oro coronado. The bride says, our nuptial bed of flowers, guarded by lions' dens, in a purple days, built on peace, crowned with 1,000 of golden pieces. Now I would like to refer to Wali about the garden of life. That compares quite well with the previous one. If you don't look simply at the words, but just at the second meaning. उसको हासिल क्यों कर हुए जग में फरोग जिंदगी, गिर्दिश अफलाक है जिसको अयाग जिंदगी. ए अजीज़ों सैर गुलशन है गिल दाग आलम, सोबत अहबाब है माने में बाग जिंदगी. So perhaps, I don't know, should I read the English translation? It is not needed, I believe. Juan de la Cruz is, oh, now I forgot to translate this into English, sorry. Is quite close to yes. I skip a few things because I forgot to put my Spanish quotations in that. Now we die in the desire for death. मरते हैं आरज़ू में मरने की. I think this is quite famous. हम वहाँ हैं जहाँ से हो के हमको भी कुछ हमारी खबर नहीं आती. मरते हैं आरज़ू में मरने की, मौत आती है पर नहीं आती. So now we come to Coplas del Alma by San Juan. It's quite close to it. En esta vida que yo vivo es privación de vivir y así es continuo morir hasta que viva contigo. Oye, mi Dios, lo que te digo, que esta vida no la quiero, que muero porque no muero. Because I die, because I do not die. This life that I'm living, it is जिंदगी की महरूमी होती, ये जिंदगी. In this continuous death, unless I go to live with God, Listen to me, my God, to what I say. That life, I don't want it because I am dying, because I do not die. Now I try to take it close to Mirza Ghalib. हम वहाँ हैं जहाँ से हो के भी कुछ हमारी खबर नहीं आती. मरते हैं आरज़ू में मरने की, मौत आती है पर नहीं आती. Oye, mi Dios, lo que te digo, que esta vida no la quiero, que muero porque no muero. I die because I'm not dying. So this life which I am living, it is deprivation of real life. And this life is a continuous death until I go and meet you, my God. Listen to me, my God. So San Juan de la Cruz says, que muero porque no muero. Listen to me, my God. This life I do not want because I'm dying, because I do not die. हमारे हैं हम हैं जहाँ से हो के उनको भी कुछ हमारी खबर नहीं आती. मरते हैं आरज़ू में मरने की, मौत आती है पर नहीं आती. You see, we are not so far from oh my God, I was quoting in Spanish here. Well, I'm sorry for that. But it's मरते हैं आरज़ू में मरने की. It's quite similar from Mirza Ghalib. Muero porque no muero. मरते हैं आरज़ू में मरने की. आगे चलिए. You see, we can very much make a comparison between Juan de la Cruz in his mystical poetry and the mystical poetry of the garden here. मोहब्बत थी चमन से लेकिन अब ये बेदिमागी है कि मौज बूए गुल से नाक में आता है दम मेरा. So I'm just skipping because, oh my God, this is French. Sorry for that. You see, we have in Juan de la Cruz, we have also this idea of wasal. Union and separation are both residences for love. This poor beaten heart, God knows which one he may go. And they have, in Juan de la Cruz, we have exactly the same image, which here it is. I'm comparing Mirza Ghalib and Juan de la Cruz. Esta vida que yo vivo es privación de vivir, y así es continuo morir hasta que viva contigo. Oye, mi Dios, lo que te digo, que esta vida no la quiero, que muero porque no muero. So it is more or less equivalent to हम आगे चलिए please. आगे आगे हम वहाँ हैं जहाँ से हमको भी कुछ हमारी खबर नहीं आती, मरते हैं आरज़ू में मरने की मौत आती है पर नहीं आती, मिर्ज़ा गालिब. So, así es, continuo morir hasta que viva contigo. It is almost the same wording, you know. Oye, mi Dios, lo que te digo, God, listen to what I say. This life, I do not want it because I'm dying. I'm not dying. मौत आती है पर नहीं आती. So here we have a striking encounter. It is, of course, different wording, but the very idea of dying but not dying, you know, reaching fana. Esta vida que yo vivo es privación de vivir y así es continuo morir hasta que viva contigo. Oye, mi Dios, lo que te digo, que esta vida no la quiero, que muero porque no muero. You have to listen to the music as well. This life, I'm living in deprivation of life. It is indeed a life without life, and an everlasting death until I could live with thee. Listen, my God, to what I say. This life of mine, I don't like. I'm dying because I do not die. Now I will jump. Again, comparing, you know, my sleeps are his, so is my brain, and so are my nights. Your hair locks that are disheveled on my arm, and I think I would like to end. Yes, I don't know if you can see this. My sleeps are his, so he is in my brain, and so are my nights. Your hair locks that are disheveled on my arm. And we have a very similar quotation in Spanish with a very big time gap, but the encounter is very much there. Esta vida que yo vivo es privación de vivir y así es continuo morir hasta que viva contigo. Oye, mi Dios, lo que te digo, que esta vida no la quiero, que muero porque no muero. And I'm sure that you will recognize tasawwuf into this. The life I'm living, the life I'm living is deprivation of life. It is indeed a life without life, and an everlasting death, until I could live with thee. Listen, my God, to what I say. The life of mine I do not like. I'm dying because I do not die. This is, you see, there is the way of playing with words and the continuous contradiction that is typical of ghazal also, and typical of tasawwuf. From one contradiction to another, you go ahead. So does Juan de la Cruz. I would like to thank you for your kind attention.
Good afternoon, all the delegates and the distinguished guests and experts, and also the two speakers who have shared their experience and presenting such informative papers. The first paper, Professor Mohanty, of course, it's focused on theory, more of theory, and then he went into the definition of translation and how it has broadened over a course of time, and now scholars have been including everything under the sun in translation studies. By quoting some of these speakers, some of the scholars who worked, especially in the linguistic paradigm, he was mentioning about Naida, Newmark, Anthony Pym, and others. But that's one perspective. Of course, so now maybe some kind of deliberation on the term itself is required at a time when people are getting confused, and it has become a very general and generic time. And as you go by Andre Lefebvre, where he says translation is rewriting, he says rewriting, the process of rewriting is there in translations, in anthologizations, and in literary criticism and historicization, in editing, etc., etc. He calls all of them as refracted texts. Okay, so such broad definition, with such broad definition, we operate in the field of translation studies, though we began with these linguistic theories of translations, which focus mainly on the text without going into the contextual aspects, the purpose, the scopus, why certain texts are translated at a certain point in time into a certain culture in a certain way. So without going to the looking at the text, words and sentences, how certain things are translated, what is the kind of equivalence established, etc., etc. But maybe some, this is a very timely paper, I feel. People have to go back, because linguistic paradigm, maybe those who are working in cultural studies, they say, oh, we have moved away from this. It's no longer, we are not worried about equivalence and all. So we have moved away from that. Translation studies has evolved much more after the cultural turn, after the social turn. But still, see, ultimately you have to work with sentences, words and sentences. It is the text that matters when it comes to translation. But of course, translation is not always between the languages. It can be intralingual, intersemiotic. These are the other categories Roman Jakobson himself introduced way back in 1957. So all of you are familiar with these things. But it's a kind of, Professor Mohanty's paper is a kind of a thought-provoking process for all of us to look back at the beginnings of the field of translation studies, how it evolved over a period of time, what happened to the term and concept, etc. And the second paper, I really appreciate, sir. Sir, you are from a practical perspective. Here is a practical translator who knows Spanish, Urdu, and French, and he. These are your translations, sir. If I am not wrong, you are the translator. So this is a practical translation. As you know, poetry is the most complex of all literature to translate. And also mystic poetry and metaphors and all, you know, some of these things are peculiar, specific or unique to a particular culture. So when you are translating Urdu poetry into other languages, I know what kind of issues you face and how you overcome. And see, poetry in translation is also a translation. If you translate a Urdu poem into Spanish or French, it should read and pass off as a poem in that language as well. So for that, literal translation doesn't work. And there are certain issues like connotation, for instance. If you, for certain words, maybe connotation is different. If you go for literal translation, there are so many issues are involved when you go to poetry translation. It's very difficult. Not everybody can be a translator of poetry. It's compared to, people like you and me easily translate short fiction, but poetry, unless you, see, there is an argument also that unless you're a poet, you cannot translate poetry. You have to have that kind of high creativity. You should be a creative writer in the target language. Only then you can translate something from another language into your language. Unless you are a poet, you may not come up with a poem. And also because I don't know these languages Urdu, but only when he speaks I know, but the script I can't read, and Spanish, of course, I have no knowledge. But I just want to say something about the Mirza Ghalib's translations in Telugu. They're very popular. One particular translation done by Dasarathy Rangacharya. He's a poet from Telangana, this area. Recently, I think he was given an award after the separation of the state into Telangana, Andhra. He was given some award also. So in his poetry, I have seen his introduction. In the introduction, he says he lived with those poems. He tried to digest Mirza Ghalib for a long time. Once he digested, then he tried to produce that, recreate that into Telugu, and that reminded me of something like cannibalism. Though this is not a post-colonial concept, or there's no power equation or something, but it's something like that. You read something and make it a part of yourself, and then recreate it in another language, or produce the poem in another language. And also in the introduction written to this by another secretary, AP Sahitya Academy, the then AP Sahitya Academy secretary, he says it's like it feels as though Ghalib himself is writing in Telugu, or this Dasarthi must be Ghalib in his previous birth. Okay, this is how he commented. And also in Telugu, generally they use this expression parakaya pravesham, entering into somebody's soul. So this is often used in the introductions written by experts to these translations to say that this reads very well, it reads original, as though the Ghalib himself has written it in Telugu. This is how. So what best compliment you need. So with this, I invite the house to interact with the two paper presenters. We have to finish, I think, by one or 2 minutes. 1 or 2 questions we can take. So feel free to ask any questions if you have any queries, and the house is open.
Yeah, this question is for the second paper. Sir, did you find that when you're looking at Spanish and Urdu, that you found a lot of cognates because these are at some point, I mean, we know that they are Indo-European languages. These are Indo-European languages, and some cognates are visible. For instance, this adobe, actually, this adobe is could be phonologically, like perhaps it's adornment in English, and as a synonym of decorate, adorn. So adobe in Spanish. So I don't know if I'm correct, but I discern some sort of phonological sort of similarity there, and that these cognates, did you find that they were spread out? Because if it's mystical, or if it deals with certain common themes, then there might be a sprinkling of cognates, quite a few cognates that you might have found in the languages.
Of course, epics played a great role into diffusing concepts. But adobe, as far as I know, is the Arabic adhub, which means decorated. And from that, in modern Spanish, we still have adobe. Adobe is plastering a wall in modern Spanish, plastering a wall. And then also, you know, in America, in the land of information technology, they created Adobe, Photoshop. Yes, but Adobe is from that part of the country in USA where Spanish is very common. So Azub is, you see, for example, my Spanish writer, Juan de la Cruz, about wine, he talks of vino adobado, that is decorated wine, because he wants to sublime the idea of wine. So he says azub, adobe. In those days in Spanish, azub was pronounced adobe, but it's clear Arabic. And vino adobado, that was sort of sacred wine But he does not want to allude to, the Christian Catholic wine. He does not want to hear about that. And so he says, Bino adobado. And this is something he takes straight away from Arabic. He was a great scholar. He knew Hebrew, Arabic, and Latin, and of course Spanish. But he had to hide that fact.
Any more questions? Yeah. There's. Can you pass on the mic to?
Mine is not a question, rather it's a compliment to the gentleman on the stage. Sir, I am actually thoroughly inspired with the depth of knowledge that you have of the subject that you spoke about, as well as, you are truly is an inspiration for all budding researchers like me. You have shown us, if we want to do research, the level of hard work, the level of time and energy that should go into a research to make it worthwhile and inspiring for others. Thank you for coming here and addressing us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm indebted to your attention and kindness.
When you translated, both, Urdu as well as in Spanish and French, did you find differences in the emotions? Or they were the same, in mystic poetry?
I would say that as far as mystical Urdu poetry, which is a very broad concept actually, one could question, is there any Urdu poetry without mystical background? So there is hardly any correspondence with French as far as I know. Perhaps if we accept Baudelaire in 19th century, he was inspired indirectly by Arabic poetry, indirectly. But otherwise, you see, the poetry of the Siglo de Oro, the golden century, so-called in Spanish, was actually reviving Spanish and I would say Italian tradition, but from Sicily. Sicily, for a long time, had been a kind of poetical court with both Arabic and Norman French and Spanish. And the Arabic influence in Sicily was very deep, as you might have known. And then that goes all the way to Spain. Yes. Yes. Yes, of course, Toledo School also. Yes. But that did not reach French. It is only because of my personal, I have been quite a few years in Spain as a young lad. I used to have hair. So then I was in contact with Arabic culture. In those days was Spanish, fascism. And we had to pretend, being very much devotees, to go to convents, and we would go to retreat in convents, but we knew that in the convent's library there was lots of Arabic. And monks were so happy to explain us. That was forbidden, but they were so happy to do it. So that was a connection I had with the Muslim world before coming into Urdu. And I'm strikingly surprised that the close link that we have with 16th and even 17th Spanish poetry that was deeply infused by Arab and Persian poetry.
Thank you, sir. With the permission of our worthy chair, I would like to conclude the proceedings of this plenary session by expressing my sincere gratitude to our esteemed speakers and the chair. Your contribution and guidance have made this session exceptional. Thank you all.